Hi, welcome everyone to this panel on physical violence and digital violence against female journalists. New challenges for an old problem. We have a series of presentations today in Spanish and English. The one in English, the person also speaking Spanish, so it was just the presentation was prepared in English, but can answer questions in Spanish. No issues with that. Now we will have some communications and discussions. The original this panel was considered for a topic that we believe is very urgent and very trendy. I don't know if this morning you heard to Minister Vallejos to speak about this topic, to the person from UNESCO about the growing violence directed to female journalists, female women, and journalists. So data suggests that if you start adding even more layers of intersectionality, the worse the problem gets worsened. Dissidences, racial issues, and so on. So we wish to finish on a somehow positive note to set some challenges, check some proposals, and some things that could be done. I apologize, there's a conflict in the schedule, so the first panelist is going to have to fly after presenting, but it's more than open to answer questions, receive suggestions, and contact afterwards. So I don't want to bore you. I leave you with Patricia Peña, the first panelist. So I don't overdo on my time. I want to keep my time. So good afternoon. Thank you all, men and women, and everybody, and those following online. As Ingrid said, if you participated from yesterday's panel, this conversation about how we are somehow connecting the concepts of gender digital violence and gender information, this is presenting a doubt, a risk, a permanent risk. And this is also something that I'd like to share today. How do we measure this in Chile? How do we measure this in Chile? Thinking about the data we see abroad, and how can we approach this? This news appeared, these two news are associated to a same study. First, I'd like to say that when speaking about gender digital violence, we're speaking about a phenomenon that is not new or recent. Starts to happen when the internet gets expanded in the life of women. Perhaps digital violence was very much associated to the women's field in terms of a violence between the couples. But if we're talking about the gender violence, the main problem is that we didn't have any data or a focus. It was considered that this was a type of violence less important or less real, meaning it is violence that happens in the virtual world. And so it was civil society organization work that allows to put this topic in international discussion agendas. In Chile, we started to see this topic emerge in 2018 when our movement, feminist movement, in May 2018, in the campuses of universities, of course, had their main focus of diffusion in the social media platforms. Perhaps it was the first time of cases such as Nido that ONG NGO, it was a case that massified this concept of digital harassment related to women and the dissidences and the collectives. Then, during the pandemics, this in this exercise of being much more present in the digital platforms makes emerge different ways of approaching the problem of digital violence. And one thinks about the focus about journalists, female journalists and communicators. In Latam, this is related to communicators and female journalists that are covering topics related to sexual and reproductive rights, but also the defense of the territories and different environments. Now, in the survey that is organized in 2020, it was published in UNESCO and the International Center of Journalism, begins to speak about some alarming figures of a survey performed to 1,000 participants, and not included in the sample to Chilean journalists. But we started to see that 73% would say that they had received some type of assault, harassment, aggression that is highly related to some other surveys that we do have on that same period performed with larger populations of women that also show the same statistics, meaning approximately 70% of women that inhabit internet at some point in their life have received some type of harassment, have went through harassment situations. It's a topology. It is an important issue to measure. Digital violence and gender are dynamic. There's not a single way of classifying or a single way of understanding them because they're also related with the evolution of the use of internet and technologies. Today we're saying that many of them focus in social media platforms where this right to express themselves is happening, but in the present and in the future it might be related with the use of generative artificial intelligence that is related with videos, manipulation, and different types of features. I said that a very important point in this studies in understanding the connection between the violence typology and getting somehow leaving this idea that this is violence that is less or that generates a minor or lower impact, like not real. That is related to the fact that in the end, violence and digital harassment situations do have an emotional and physical consequence. And effectively, as it was mentioned yesterday in Beckham for freedom of expression, that is for gender, this misinformation related to gender will have a huge consequence in executing our right to participate in the digital environment and having a voice. So, in general, in countries such as Chile, this is something where we still don't have enough data. This is something we share with Ingrid that we don't have enough data in order to size it. We do need to move forward in this type of studies. And that is also something that makes us look at a second phenomenon, which is that when doing a very improvised exercise, for instance, with organizations such as the Feminists and Communicators Network of Journalists, that groups over 100 communicators in different regions, when asking the question of, for instance, if you have any type of protocol or a self care system in digital terms, that is another assumption we have, a hypothesis to try and identify if, for instance, at the workplace, when performing your profession, when executing your profession, do you have those protocols? Because both situations are getting mixed. So, what we see here is that gender digital violence is connected to gender misinformation situations or based on gender or in gender situations that are associated, for instance, to situations that might be related to an attack, verbal attack, situations of trolling, humiliation, some type of situation that they create narrative about a journalist woman that is covering a certain topic. Now, this is also something related, as the report says, from Ademicam, from the relatorship, specifically with the main effect, which is silence, meaning to leave the internet. That's why this invites to not leave the internet, and that it's also something that raises the question, which in the end is also connected to these attacks happen in digital platforms that are basically, well, in our countries, three social media. We're talking about the Meta group, comments such as X, that allegedly do have systems or mechanisms to perform these reports or these complaints when having accounts that are dealing with these harassments. But with any of you that have reported an account or has used these mechanisms, realize that what they receive is actually a form where it gets registered as a case. There's something related to the fact that many people think that there's like a call center where you can make a complaint on the cases of a harassment situation, but that doesn't. It's not the case. And in this discussion, of course, we need to include the businesses, the companies. There is a responsibility that is very important regarding to the answers we receive as users. So when speaking about protocols and this lacks of uses, well, nowadays the recommendations are basically related to first, not to shush down. Do not shush down. This is a key recommendation. Don't be quiet on that. We need to generate solidarity of gender, intersectional solidarity, solidarity thinking about the academia and civil society coming from there to understand that it's not only to measure it in order to have the data just to have the data, but we need to generate those data in order to generate incidences, because this is not something about just having laws that typify some types of violence, but it also means to be able to have public policies that emphasize much more having safeguarding systems. It's being discussed a law on the execution, I'm sorry, the protection and the safeguarding of the journalist execution. We need for that law to include, for instance, some connection to the situations of what happens in the identification of situations where there's harassment or misinformation related to gender. So when speaking about protocols, the second thing is that we do need to move forward in protocols that will allow us to record and generate evidence. This has two sides. To generate the evidence is also a way in the future of being able to take this case to a higher situation. For instance, if today it involves situations of private pictures, personal information, because that is connected dangerously with the case of with the issue of personal data. We need to try and understand what are the profiles and accounts. This is related to typology when these are attacks that are organized by real profiles or when these are profiles organized in boots type of attacks. We also need to generate some screenshots. But especially in the final point, we do need to start informing ourselves regarding self-care and digital safety, digital security, and that is related to making decisions. When do we decide to be in platforms, in social medias that are of a common use or commercials, and when, in the execution of our profession, in reporting, for instance, do we use another platform that will allow to not leave a fingerprint, more encrypting, no tracing, and many times we don't know about them. So I would like to finish by commenting that this is related to the second part. So this is related to how to move forward. For 2 years, we have been working in a project financed by a fund of artificial intelligence projects, feminist artificial intelligence. When I say we're working, there's a design professor from the design area in Universidad Católica and two people from the civil society. This is protected data related to statistics related to gender and analyzing what are the things that we can do on this topic, because also I mentioned briefly when I was saying there's no call center that helps us to solve this issue, that is related to that. Who do we call when we need help? Civil societies organizations are not enough. They do not have the capabilities. So this is a prototype to generate a chatbot, a system, a communicational system that wishes first to talk about your case and then to provide information and guidance, and in general, on how to approach this digital harassment situation. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Peña, for this presentation. Now we will listen about the presentation from Dr. Summer Highland from Nye Center for Journalism in the Americas. Her lecture is titled Violence in Social Media Violence and Gender, Censorship and Resistance in Latin American Journalism.
I'm going to talk today a little bit about social media, violence, and gender for journalists throughout Latin America. And I'm going to present it talking about two different studies that I've done. And we talk a lot about the optimistic side of technology, right? The way that we've seen social media generate political participation, social media generate community, identity. But of course, we've also seen that technology and social media in particular have generated new kinds of threats and new types of risks that journalists have to face. And so some colleagues and I, Ryan Wallace and Lourdes Cueva Chacon, we did this study recently that looked at what are the dimensions of violence that journalists face online in Latin America. And we took a socio-technical approach to this, and it's a little bit theoretical, I know, but essentially a socio-technological approach says that we have to look at the technological side as well as the social side. We have to look at all of the actors involved within this new digital media ecology, and really, in order to really understand how technology is affecting journalism and journalists. So we wanted to look at human actors. who are the human actors in journalism processes right now, right? Yeah, we know about journalists, but who else is involved in there? And how might their roles and practices be changing? And then what about technological actants, the devices that they use, the platforms that they use? What role are these technological actants playing in the production of journalism? And the audiences, that's another human actor within all of this, but they're taking on new roles, as we all know. We went from talking about consumers to prosumers, and one of the things that we found in this study that I'll talk about in a little bit is that social media audiences are actually playing this role of agent provocateur, which means that they are stirring up trouble for journalists online. And then how are the journalistic activities changing? Throughout all of the different stages of the journalistic process, what changes do we see resulting because of violence, because of threats? So we wanted to see what is the impact of technology or in particular online threats to the relationships and interactions between all of the actors within the journalistic processes. What were the changes to journalistic practices as a result of those interactions that resulted from the violence? And then how did journalists cope? What were their responses? How do they deal with all of that digital violence? And we did this by conducting a series of focus groups online with journalists from throughout Latin America, 13 different countries, 11 women and 9 men journalists. And we found that there were 3 different dimensions of social media violence. The first is that the violence was personal. It was directed specifically at the journalists as human beings. And when it came to women or LGBTQ plus journalists, that's when we saw the attacks get really personal. It wasn't just saying, you're a bad journalist. It was, you are a bad woman and you deserve to die for what you wrote. And you can see some of the different quotes from what the journalist said here. They're in Spanish. But it was very common for journalists to be called, women journalists to be called prostituta, fea, gorda. That has absolutely nothing to do with their journalistic work, as we all know. Also interesting was we found that these campaigns against the journalist, or these attacks against the campaign, oh my goodness, I can't talk. The attacks against the journalists were actually orchestrated campaigns. These were not just some disgruntled reader who decided to take to social media and say, I don't like this journalist. These were very systematic efforts to discredit the journalists. And what we've also found was that these were campaigns that were orchestrated by the governments. The governments were using, and in some cases, according to the journalists, paying their partisans to create these systematic attack campaigns against the journalists. And then, of course, the other dimension that we found was that these attacks were also, they had offline consequences. One of the things that the journalist said to us over and over again was that any attacks that are made on social media just kind of get dismissed as if, oh, well, how bad can it really be? It's online, it's social media, it doesn't really matter. But that's not the case. The threats and the violence and the attacks that we're seeing online, every single one of them had offline consequences, whether it was a physical consequence in terms of violence, a physical consequence in terms of mental health and stress on the body, or physical consequences in terms of how they did their jobs, the devices that they carried, and the ways that they practiced their journalism. And then, as I mentioned, we were interested in how did the journalists cope with these 3 levels of threats. And we found that one of the main responses was that the responses to the threats were individual. The journalists were on their own. For the most part, they said that their news organizations did nothing to support them. And if you were a woman journalist or a freelancer, you were especially vulnerable. The women journalists in particular said their newsrooms were like, is this really a big deal? Which is not good. So they were on their own, and they changed, in some cases, their personal accounts on social media. They would just stop posting altogether in the hopes of avoiding any attacks. They changed their professional practices. they also stopped posting professional accounts, or they would make sure that anything that they posted on the professional account was so benign, if you will, that there would be really no way that anybody would come after them for what they posted. They changed their online presence generally. They said that it just caused them too much stress to be online, so they would just stay offline if possible. And then when they were offline, they talked about how they didn't want to go anywhere alone. They would make sure that, oh my goodness, that they were having to always be connected to the newsrooms. There were also responses at the organizational level and the industry level. And the organizational level, I'm just going to kind of skip through all these because the real thing that I wanted to talk about was how at the organizational level, one of the things that I heard over and over again from the women journalists was that the violence that they faced on a regular basis, not only on social media, but even in their own newsrooms, led them to say, we are fed up with this. We're going to go out on our own and we're going to create our own entrepreneurial digital native news sites. And so I started studying these digital native news sites, and one in particular is Alaraca, which is from El Salvador, and it was created specifically to be a feminist media outlet. And Alaraca was started because of a project that they were doing that was funded by Planned Parenthood, and they could not find any media outlet in El Salvador to publish it because it was funded by Planned Parenthood, which is a pro-abortion organization. And so because of that, they said, okay, well, we're gonna start our own media, and they started Alaraca. And then there's La Nota from Argentina. Very similar. They were founded, born from the pro-women's rights movements that were happening throughout Argentina, throughout Latin America, and then this news site resulted. And so in my book, I have a chapter specifically focused on the role of these digital native news sites that are focused on feminism in Latin America. And the role of activism in all of these is so important because they said, yes, we're journalists, but we are also activists. So they were at the vanguard of this new movement of incorporating feminism and journalism in their production. And they found that they could do this because because there was the sexism in the newsroom, and that they just said, you know, we have to leave. The innovation and technologies that were going on at the time also allowed them to be able to strike out on their own and create these new sites and to have different perspectives, have different voices, have different narratives to tell different stories. And then again, that activism, that I don't want to say the rise of activism because there's always been a very vibrant protest culture in Latin America, but in particular, the growth of the feminist movement in recent years in Argentina and throughout Latin America really contributed to the rise of these sites being able to be seen as acceptable and for them to be able to find a niche and to find an audience. And so they have upended hierarchies by only having women in production roles and editorial roles. They flip the narratives that they're telling, and they do not shy away from talking about their connections to feminist activists and movements. So with that, I will say thank you very much.
Now we will give the floor to Professor Ingrid Bachmann, and her presentation is Misinformation Around Women Journalists, a Growing Threat. Thank you, Lujan. Actually, it's a good segue to continue with this presentation. I don't have much data because, as Patricia said, it's something that has not been studied, but there is anecdotal evidence of people that tells you things and tells you about situations that they have had happening to them, and it goes back to misinformation, which is not new at all, and it is not exclusive to Latin America nor Chile. It's a global issue. But for a long time, we've seen that there is one type of misinformation that is targeted to women in the public sphere. in the political world, in the world of sports, regarding celebrities and journalists, and actually a high percentage, even though difficult to define precisely because of the categories that Patricia mentioned, that it is difficult to distinguish because it's always dynamic and fairly fluid. There is in gender violence and in gender harassment, there is a segment related specifically with misinformation, meaning information that is deliberately fake and that aims at harming the reputation of the person, whether professionally or personally. And it happens particularly with journalists that are covering gender issues, conflicts, or polarizing issues, and also around politics. And that is a growing threat. Actually, Patricia talked about the report of Julie Passetti et al. Regarding surveys of journalists. And yes, part of the issue is that much of the misinformation is due to organized, orchestrated campaigns in digital channels, and apart from the lack of a regulatory framework and a process to report this, there is this narrative that this is online. It happens in a virtual instance, as if that made it less severe, as if it didn't have real consequences in the real lives of people. Misinformation, harassment, abuse, attacks brings along psychological problems. There are circumstances in their way of living. People end up quitting social media, adjusting their routines. People change how they do their work. People self censor when they do all sorts of work. So, yes, there is an issue. Women are affected more because they are journalists and because they are women suffering this violence, which is something that's very, very severe. Now, what type of evidence have we seen at UNESCO and also other organizations that work for freedom of speech? We have seen that these are multi platform attacks. They don't happen in a single space, which is why many times we believe that these are orchestrated campaigns. These are because if you start looking at it, how is it possible that just because someone launched a piece of news or someone covered something, and a certain story of an affair of a journalist is released, because many times the attacks revolve around their personal lives to question their morality. So if they have a relationship outside of their marriage, that is published on Twitter, WhatsApp, Facebook, etc., in five places simultaneously. It needs to be orchestrated, but it's very difficult to prove that. And also, if we relate this with other types of events, for instance, conspiracy theories, people that suspect that this person is connected to other people. Let's say this is an example that I have to show you later. Why is this issue disclosed now and not an issue of a person of another political party? That's suspicious, and so on and so forth. And we have seen how the situation has been increasing, and much of the information does have anti women misogynistic content. It questions their ability to act. I will not show you any type of distorted images, but there are distorted, manipulated images. And something else that we've seen in Latin America is that misinformation or the first message comes from politicians. Many times, politicians that are in a position of authority or politicians that are candidates, and the most famous case is the campaign against Patricia Campos by Bolsonaro. And there was, and she has been awarded. She is a famous journalist. She did have the support of Folha de Sao Paulo, her press media, and the campaign of Bolsonaro was disseminating misinformation through WhatsApp to their followers, and they contacted the person behind that campaign. And this is an industry of misinformation. So the media part of this is that there was a campaign of misinformation against Patricia, and they said many things. And Bolsonaro, his children said that this was fake, that that was a lie, but also that the sources that Patricia had talked to her after that she had offered sexual favors. And it cost 5 years of a judicial case to have a conviction for Bolsonaro for this. But how do we even talk about this? If you Google this, if you Google, many times in the media they talked about Bolsonaro was convicted for sexist comments. But I'm sorry, that's not a sexist comment. This is a campaign of misinformation. It is bad, it's severe, and why? Through sexual favors. And let's not even talk about the online and offline consequences. She couldn't even go outside. People were attacking her all over the place. And how do you even do your work? So this isn't something minor or something to dismiss, right? What have we seen in terms of misinformation around female journalists? There are messages that are created to damage their reputation or to question the person and as a professional, to question their intelligence, to question their integrity, their abilities. Someone talked about the abuse that is related to their sexual behavior or to their lack of intelligence or the fact that they are making up stuff, the fact that they are offering sexual favors, and so on and so forth. And it has been seen that, unfortunately, many times these are anonymous messages. The case of Bolsonaro is famous because he did it, but this was disseminated by so many people. What do you do when a campaign starts by just an account which is anonymous and it's impossible to trace? Let's not even talk about the role of the platforms that completely dismiss their responsibility in the matter, and it's based on anonymity. But if you analyze the networks, you realize that it is coordinated. In several instances, as Summer said, the coordination does happen, and the content is meant to humiliate people, and it sometimes could seem innocent or harmless. Let's say that this journalism so is kind of dumb, but it's still it gives you, it makes you question something, and it makes you question your own work, and it ends up in all sorts of damages. And we've seen this narrative too that questions their moral their morals. For instance, the fact that people have allegedly uh, relationships outside of their marriage, or that they are of a different sexual orientation. And in the last 5 years, we've seen manipulation of pictures. We've seen pornographic deep fake, which is very troublesome because any person that has tried to complain or report, they know how difficult it is to stop that the images continue to be disseminated. And there's evidence of state agents that are organized. In some cases, there have been suspicions of the state agents of foreign governments that are involved. From China, from Russia, are the main villains that are pointed out. And this type of information is not only that, it usually comes along with other uh, types of violence. For instance, the attempt at doxing, revealing the address, the phone number, or other personal information of the person. For instance, your kid leaves school on Wednesdays at 5. And if you go to the police to report that, that's just not a threat, that's a piece of information. But why is it made public? That is basically to intimidate you. And the fear is that this is impunity because there is a lack of a regulatory framework, and in many cases, how do you even trace it back to the origin? Patricia Campos Melo managed to go to the courts. She went to several rounds of appeals, and she was able to identify the person that said a number of things about her. But with other people, that's not the case. And this is just an example. I won't uh, show you the original messages because I won't amplify this. But some years ago, Leslie Ayala from La Tercera published a piece regarding Daniel Jadwe, who is the mayor of Recoleta. He was criticized, and he was criticized among certain groups. And then she launched another piece about a number of incidents related to the demonstrations in Chile, and if whether certain people had actually died because of police violence or armed forces violence or not. They were accused in this piece that they were making up an autopsy, because what did they do? They accounted for an autopsy that said that a certain person had not died because of police violence, and certain people were involved, or so the story says. And some people went online and there wasn't such an autopsy, and they were accused of making up an autopsy. And Juan Manuel the next day said, "We've been accused of inventing an autopsy." And the journalists did have the exclusive information because it before it was publicly available. So what they said is, big hugs to Leslie Ayala, who is Leslie Ona, her ad, because she got the worst of it. And this is important. Precisely a few hours ago, someone asked me about this. Yes, but all the journalists are under attack. No, it's not the same. If it's a man or a woman, it's different. Her partner said it. She got it so much worse than he did. They were both attacked, but she got the worst of it. Actually, she continued to be attacked, not only with misinformation, but also people asking who is paying her. Once again, she was morally questioned. This is the former partner of a certain politician, or she is the friend of a certain person. She is always questioned in terms of how she conducts her work. It's been awful, and I will show this tweet. And she says, "I tried. I promise I tried, but it's impossible." And she does have the support of her employer. She needed to stand up for herself, and she is saying, "I'm done with X," and she came back next week, of course, because it was impossible for her to refrain, but it is mentally draining. And I'm wrapping up with this, saying that 5 years ago I attended a workshop around this in the Knight Center for Journalism for the Americas, and I remember thinking, hopefully, I never had to teach this to my students, and I never even realized that 5 years ago I should have been doing it. I teach future journalists, and I should have been teaching tools to face this, because this is just a fact of life that they will go through this. So it is a challenge for us educators. I don't know if I have all the tools, but we have to start talking about this. We have to protect the sources, and we have to protect, and I have to do it, and we are doing it. We have to teach them to protect themselves, because this isn't an easy task. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. Now we have the presentation from Professor Marta Milena Barrios Cortez from Universidad del Norte. She will talk about the lack of safety and security of activism of those journalists that are victims of violence in Colombia. Good morning. I will be referring to my notes to keep up with the time that I was allocated. But first of all, I'm happy and I'm thankful for having the opportunity to share the results of this investigation regarding journalism, emotions, and activism that I've been carrying out in Colombia with my partner, Liz Vega. I'd like to start with a little bit of context. The national state of Colombia is, I'm sorry, the emotional state of each person in Colombia has been influenced by the armed conflict that we have had going on for over 50 years. First, the conflict with the FARC, but now, according to the Colombian Red Cross, we have 8 ongoing armed conflicts in Colombia, and it means that there is great violence ongoing against journalists, not only online but also offline. And just look at the degree of violence that is expressed allegedly after the peace agreement that was signed with the FARC. We see in this case that journalism has been paying the price for this, and actually, Actually, 426 journalists have been murdered in Colombia. Among those, many women that, as our speakers before me have said, not only have to withstand the physical violence, the online violence, there are many other types of violence that overlap in order to turn the exercise of our profession in Colombia something that is sometimes heroic. And I will share with you the case of three women that definitely were heroes, and they have withstand personal violence, and they have withstand online violence, and they continue to work as journalists in mainstream media, and they need to be granted the merit for that. They are Jeanette Bedoya, who is the gender editor of El Tiempo. She was awarded with the World Award of Freedom of Press of UNESCO. She was tortured, she was raped, she was kidnapped while she was conducting a piece on the prison of Bogota. After that, that was a very painful time of her life. After she was kidnapped, her mother, for instance, was trying to obtain her or to follow the car in which she was taken, and the lady suffered so much. She has been a hero, definitely, and she is the gender editor of El Tiempo. We also have Patricia Lara, journalist, writer, activist for peace. She has been awarded too, and she was a victim of violence in her family. Her sister was shot with over 30 bullets, and she left young children, and in her family she suffered other cases of kidnapping. We also have Maria Dusan, who is one of the most well-known Colombian journalists at the moment, and she did suffer violence in the case of the murder of her sister, journalist Sylvia Dusan, and at some point she was working for the London BBC, conducting or working on peace communities when she was murdered by paramilitary forces. And her case, just like the case of her family or the family of Patricia Lara, is something that remained in full impunity. And everything that we know of has been thanks to the journalist investigation of Maria Jimena. And in the case of Jeanette Bedoya, she took her case to the Inter American Courts of Human Rights, and after 11 years of inactivity, she or the courts declared the Colombian state as guilty of those crimes. So they are women who are resilient, who are activists, and we wanted to ask ourselves what were the key topics and emotions of the texts, and how emotions are associated with the creation of patterns and trends of activism. And we see in the literature lots of activity around this, and we see social media, journalism, activism, and we see this cluster in green, which are the new studies that have been related, uh, that have been conducted in 2023 or recently. And we see that there is a great opportunity because, at least in relation to journalism, activism, and emotions, there isn't a rich intellectual production. Actually, in the field of emotions, we only have 8 papers, and our uh, former speakers have mentioned that we have to continue working on generating data. We conducted the analysis, we downloaded all the texts from the internet of all the journalists, and then we conducted probabilistic analysis, which ended up with the investigation research based on over 100 texts. Regarding the analysis of the themes, we saw the different categories. They were validated with the experts. They were sorted, and this is the table of content of the results. And we see how fear is associated to political and institutional affairs, and these are topics that the three journalists are addressing these issues. They are recognized for that by her peers. We see how justice is also a key topic, highly connected with the emotion of pain, of bravery, of anger. We see that corruption triggers the need for protection, and these categories came up from the theory fear, pain, hope, protection, etc. But the categories that we see to your left hand side came from the texts, and as you see, they've not lingered in a single topic. However, they insist in covering a broad uh, spectrum of the reality and the political activity in Colombia, and they also have a feminist approach, and they are resilient activists and women that want to move forward, and they will not be intimidated nor by physical violence nor by online violence. And this is another association of the topics. For instance, we see love, pain, shame, highly associated to the political conflict in Colombia, conciliation also, political, or I'm sorry, social unrest, the issue of fear. These are all emotions that are related to the political conflict. And in order to account for how in the practice the statistics associations take place, we have certain quotes from their texts, and we are going to read just a little bit of the first one. It's time that those that have nothing to do with corruption but do know it report that, disclose that. Are we afraid to report this? Yes, we are. We are dealing with criminals, but should fear be more than the rights that we are having violated? And these are more results, more associations. These associations are created or established by journalists that work on certain areas. For instance, Jeanette, since she suffered sexual violence, she works a lot on fighting for the rights of women, and her feelings and the feelings of the victims are sort of intertwined in the text, creating communities that revolve around affection and pain. Here we have Jeanette, and she said, myself, with the support of a number of international organizations and through the campaign No es hora de callar, I've gone through several media, training journalists, giving them tools and keys to report on gender violence. Here we have Patricia Lara and the topics that she usually writes about are listed there, and similarly part of the very painful accounts that she shared. Maria Jimena Dusan also, she has been working on journalism to question the institutions, to challenge the powerful, and those are the emotions that she includes the most in her writing. And definitely, the writing is something that is amazing. She described the killing of Elaro, and she refers to a person that was hung from a tree and had their eyes removed, and all of those emotions are intertwined in their pieces. Now, to wrap up, we have seen 12 emotions that have been identified in the literature that have been present in the pieces of the journalists that we studied in this case study. Fear and pain are the most uh, relevant emotions as identified by other authors that have studied texts produced in societies in conflict. And there is a strong need for protection in Colombia. In Colombia, we have communities that are created around pain, and this type of activism has its own characteristics, and we need to know whether these are emotionally resilient activists, and that should be studied in future studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta Milen. After your presentation, I am afraid, I am fearful, I feel rage, and after seeing these presentations, I feel some hope. Now we're going to have a Q&A session. I don't know if you have the notes with the questions, if you can help me out with that. If you have any questions, perhaps by raising your hands, it's fine. Hi, good morning. Well, good afternoon, actually. It is a concerning topic. But there's hope, as we've seen. I am president of the National Association of Journalists, Female Journalists. We've seen several statements on this topic, especially regarding digital violence. Not only Monica Perez, Paulina Allende, Salazar, without a doubt, it's a concerning topic. So my question is for Ingrid, in terms that there's no data, how to strengthen those spaces in the civil society? How can we help with this data? But how do you visualize this future? How can we do something specifically to decrease the levels of digital violence, specifically that female journalists go through? Ingrid, it's an amazing question for all types of things. I just want to say without data, there's no diagnosis. Without diagnosis, there's no solution to a problem. So we need to start by documenting. That's somehow the logic of, I don't know if you remember what Patricia said, of save, I don't know, record the screenshots of whatever you get, because it is evidence. So storing, backing up that evidence, but also complaining about that, claiming this. UNESCO study says that from all the threats received, about 1 out of 4 actually becomes a complaint. So recognize that this is not this is a severe thing. Sometimes the media is not going to help you, won't support you. They're just going to go, is it that bad? Yeah, it is that bad. You need to know that this is a problem, and you need to communicate with a different hierarchy, the colleagues in the media room, saying that this is unacceptable, this is not a proper behavior, and you're going to have problems if you do so. But these are small steps that can happen. But the first thing is to size it, is to dimension this, and this becomes a deeper conversation, thinking that these are severe problems. Even if it's 1 out of 1,000, one is too much. So start to document it, that this is unacceptable in a society, at a workplace, at any work. So to document, to complain, to respond, but also to defend. This is extremely important, because many times what these women say is that they're alone. The police says nothing can be done, and the boss says, "Is it that bad? You're being dramatic, so you're overreacting." So they lower the importance of something that is very important. Those are the initial steps to take the backup, to take the evidence in order to report it. And also instances like this, we're saying this is happening. This is not something that we should be, I mean, it doesn't seem acceptable. It is something that has to be discussed and dealt with, and on those bases to move forward in other types of initiatives or things that could be done. Yes. I'm just gonna play as a moderator. Do you have any other questions? Hi, good afternoon. I have a question regarding the presentation from Patricia. It is not directed to anyone because it's not here, but it was interesting to me. In the PowerPoint, there were steps to follow, and the first one was to report and to communicate as a type of assault. It's interesting to me because I feel that it might promote even more hatred. We understand that any type of harassment is unacceptable. But at the same time, to publicly complain, especially in social media, generates a vicious circle that is huge, where people just don't stop being hateful. So I'm thinking about the case of the families that are involved. Perhaps the harasser, men or women, is someone that is doesn't it's not connected to their families, but the hatred will connect to their family members. So how do we talk about that? How do we manage this in the best way? I will answer this because we've talked about this with Patty. So I will be speaking somehow on behalf of both of us. But yeah, in some case, the single fact of answering generates a reaction on that. But we've also seen that there's a lot of people that um, being anonymous, sending a thread on a direct message or to your email. So literally, when you take a screenshot, look what this person said with attacks and threats and insults, and just out of nowhere, is that in some people it lowers, because some people say, I never thought you were going to talk about this. Is That's why they are doing so anonymously. So make them go through that shaming, that recognition of, okay, this is not appropriate. This is not something they should be doing. It is not just humiliating publicly, but to point it out. I'm not going to shut up on this. Actually, hashtag don't shut up. I will not shut up, and I will answer to this type of things because I do believe they are unacceptable. It's also not different when I'm criticizing a retail store because I didn't receive a product. Of course, not for all types of messages, because there are moments and areas, but that is related to that logic. A way of stopping is proving that it is not anonymous because it is not acceptable, and there are other people in your circle that will somehow criticize why you're doing this because it is not acceptable. I'd like to support with, and I apologize, but this is a personal opinion. I'm with a journalist, a radio journalist, very well known in Colombia, that has went through, like most journalists in Colombia, threats painfully, not only on behalf of the audience, anonymous audience, but on behalf of social players. Once a mayor was threatening him publicly. So we needed to have special surveillance with police officers. A officer slept in my house for 10 years, so yeah, it's hard. And I speak out of my own experience, but what we've done, or what my husband has done specifically, is not to answer, just nothing, absolutely nothing. Whatever it's been sent by online, if there's something that is concerning, of course, as the colleagues have said, you take a screenshot, you take the evidence, and you communicate it to the correspondent authorities. But in reality, I do think that, or at least that is what many journalists in Colombia do, out of these journalists that we've been studying, that of hooking up, getting hooked in conversation with haters, users online that are haters. It just brings even more hate and more violence. That is what we have experienced in our country, in such a violent country that we live in, and also can truly make things very difficult, because it goes from an online type of violence to physical violence. It happens if the level of hatred in the online grows even furthermore. That's something that I wanted to talk about, of what we've tried to do. Of course, there are no rules, no fixed rules for anything, because everybody tries to survive in whatever way. But this has worked for us, just not to answer. They sent a question for Professor Summer. Would like to know, what are the advices you would give to students, men or women, female or male students in journalism, to deal with this topic? Physical violence, online violence. Well, it's a great question. I've taught my students in the US that one thing that we should do is to understand that what we do online is the same thing we do out offline. And that means that the students must know that if that something happens online, they need to speak with someone right away, and not think, oh, it's just nothing because it's social media. No, they need to speak with whoever, editors, teachers, journalist organization, or whoever. Something else is that they need to speak with the specific organizations that are trying to protect journalists. because they need to have the data. Just like Ingrid was saying, most people are not reporting the things that happen, especially for speaking about the online world. And we need to know, they need to know in order to prevent it and take action and to finish it, like do something. What else? Oh, one thing that I always say, do not answer trolls. No reply to them because that just doesn't help. And I know because I have the same reaction. When someone says something that I don't like, I want to answer. I want to answer and I want to tell them, you're stupid or whatever, but don't do it. Ignore them. And sometimes maybe you need to stop being online for a while or I don't know, close your account, open up a new one, but don't answer. Yeah, I think that's what I would say. Do you want to add something? Thank you so much. Do you have any other questions? Yes? Thank you so much. My question is, well, when I listen to all the stories and the presentations and the lectures, I thought it was really interesting to know, is there an organism, some organization that protects us as women, as journalists, as female journalists? Is there an organization that safeguards us? Well, actually, I understand from what I've heard from Jeanette, efforts, educational efforts are being carried out on behalf of UNESCO. There's actually a draft, a document regarding protocols. Mirja has been trying, in her role of gender editor of El Tiempo journal, the most important one in Colombia, has been trying to carry out a series of compilations for a manual in terms of the procedures related to gender violence that female journalists go through. It's not easy. Many self censor them. Many need to go into exile, even. But the ones that resist teach us so much. And we need to continue to document their testimonies, their life experiences, and the way that they work on these texts with all the lessons they've learned. Well, and the scars, deep, deep scars in their soul. So I would say that we are in the process. UNESCO is one of the organizations, the other one is Jeanette's organization. It is not time to be in silence. She already has a foundation, and nowadays, she's working with the victims on this type of violence in Colombia. So it might be a good onset point. This is the last question. Thank you. Well, after all these lectures and stories, I feel a bit vulnerable somehow. As a journalist student, I wanted to ask Ingrid, Professor Ingrid, what are the measurements that she would recommend in order to protect ourselves as a student as possible when thinking about these possible threats and attacks and not having to self-censor ourselves or maybe be afraid of talking about stories that must be told? What are the advices or suggestions she might provide to be as protected as possible? Thank you. Protection measurements, there are several. Always understanding that this is very fluid, very changing. Whatever I say today might not be very useful in the future. But yes, there are areas, there are things. This is also related to the type of exposure you may have. But goes from traditional protection measurements for journalists, for instance, 2 steps, additional verifications, so you don't get hacked in your account, so your identity is not hacked, maybe having a profile that is private. In the social media, I don't really participate much. They all have padlocks. women, feminists, and from Universidad Católica. 3 reasons for trolls to just go there just because. It's like a magnet, yeah. Also, not responding trolls. There are other prevention or protection measurements, such as getting encryptions for some stuff. But I also think it's important not to operate on a fearful position. That's a bad sign. Because if I'm fearful and I don't do something, well, we're not doing a very good job. So be aware. It's like going on the street and having some prevention measurements so your cell phone doesn't get stolen. But it's not like you have to stay home all of your life, because that's not healthy. That's not living. So it's related to that, taking certain measurements. Maybe it's related to collaboration. What are the people that should know what you're doing, not going to certain places alone, not exposing yourself to risky situations. But there are also things like such as, I don't know, speaking, complaining, reporting when these things happens, documenting when this happens, taking the evidence, testimony. So regarding the question, who's going to protect me? Well, there are certain organizations from civil society that are being concerned on these topics. In Chile, we have the feminist journalist network that are highly concerned on this. They can put a police officer sleeping at your home for 10 years. No, hopefully it doesn't get to that. But yeah, they can provide some protection, some defense, some guidelines. That is also important. But always in union lies the strength. So connections, that is also very important. Thank you to all the lecturers. You have contributed quite a lot to this debate. Now I want to invite you to continue with the conversations in Universidad de Chile. And thank you for your participation and interest.